Good morning, church. Howard Hughes had it all. In the early part of the 20th century, Howard Hughes was one of the most powerful, wealthiest, most ambitious people in the world. He was a successful businessman, investing his money in a wide range of industries from engineering and electronics to aerospace. And it was aviation that Hughes was perhaps best known for, because he loved to fly planes. And he was also apt to crash them, but that never stopped him. He set multiple airspeed records, built his own planes, and owned what would later become part of American Airlines. And at his prime, his net worth, adjusted for inflation today, was around $11 billion. And because he wanted to, Howard Hughes was also a filmmaker, producing some of the most expensive movies ever made. He dated some of the most glamorous leading ladies of Hollywood, including Katharine Hepburn, Ginger Rogers, Ava Gardner, and Bette Davis. The list of Howard Hughes' accomplishments and achievements, they go on, and many looked at his life with envy and jealousy. There goes Howard Hughes. They would have loved to be Howard. I mean, who wouldn't want his life? Well, as we look back on his life today, though, not many would volunteer to trade places. Because despite his great success, Howard Hughes was not invincible. And his life was marked with many struggles, particularly against mental illness, primarily obsessive-compulsive disorder. And his OCD manifested itself in numerous ways. Even early on in his life, his close friends said that he was obsessed with the size of peas, which were his favorite food, and he had a special fork to sort them by size. And when filming his movies, production would be delayed for months as he obsessed over the trivial details of each shot. And in addition, his numerous plane crashes left him in a state of near constant pain, resulting him in being physically dependent on codeine. Toward the end of his life, he had completely vanished from public eye, becoming a recluse that barely left his home. And though some at the time laughed at his idiosyncrasies, it was really tragic. And when he died at age 70, he was barely recognizable. He had ceased to take care of himself. His 6'4" frame weighed only 90 pounds. His hair, beard, fingernails, toenails were long and unkempt. The FBI had to use his fingerprints to properly identify him. It was a sad, tragic life, but his life is one example of something that we see throughout history. That some of the most powerful and successful people in this world, whom the world assumes would live problem-free lives, have been far from it. Some have had lives marked with tragedy beyond their control, like Howard Hughes. Others have been so great in their ambition that they lost sight of what was truly important in life, and they end up dying alone. Many more have seen their success be only temporary and have lost it all, leaving this world in poverty. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you are prosperous and important in the eyes of the world. We would all be wise in seeing ourselves as we truly are. We are human, and nothing more than that. And all humans pale in comparison to the greatness of our God. And this lesson, humility, is an important lesson that fills the pages of the Bible, but it isn't always an easy lesson to learn. Those who are proud and confident in themselves often must learn humility the hard way. And such was the case of the great King Nebuchadnezzar II. We have been reading about Nebuchadnezzar as we journey through the book of Daniel this fall. Nebuchadnezzar was one of the most powerful men in ancient history, and as king of Babylon, he reigned over the mightiest empire in Mesopotamia. He was wealthy, and his treasury was full, and his building projects, such as the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, were magnificent. He achieved great military victories, and he expanded the borders of the Babylonian Empire, including seizing the city of Jerusalem. And this is where Daniel comes in. For he and his friends were among the young Jewish nobles who were taken captive into Babylon, where they were to become assimilated into Babylonian culture. Nebuchadnezzar wanted them to be all things Babylonian. And so this series is called Living Well in Exile. As we've seen thus far, Daniel and his friends have resisted and stayed true and faithful to their God, both in times of prosperity and in times of danger. And as such, God blessed them with great skill and knowledge, which Nebuchadnezzar recognized and placed them in high positions of power within his court. And this was especially true of Daniel, for God had blessed him in particular with the ability to interpret dreams. And this is something we've seen come in handy in chapter 2, as Nebuchadnezzar had many troubling dreams in his life, and we're going to see that again today in chapter 4. But to quickly recap, in chapter 2's dream, the king had a vision of a statue whose head was made of gold, arms and chest of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, and legs of iron and clay. And in that dream, the king saw a rock strike the statue and demolish it. The statue crumbles into dust from head to toe, and that rock that struck it grew to the size of a mountain in its place. And Daniel boldly told the king what this dream was about, that his great kingdom was going to fall and crumble into dust, and so would all other kingdoms after it. Babylon was the head of gold, and Babylon would crumble. And so would the next three kingdoms and empires to replace it. They would all make way for the rock, which was the kingdom of heaven. All kingdoms on earth will make way for the kingdom of God. And that's would have been a great lesson for Nebuchadnezzar. Being given a glimpse of the future and knowing that his great empire was going to eventually be no more. But as we will see today, it appears that the only thing that Nebuchadnezzar pulled from that dream was that he was the head of gold. Sure, his empire wouldn't last forever, but in his lifetime, it was glorious. And for the time being, it was golden. And in his pride, the king could see no one was his equal. No one was superior to him. In his eyes, he was bigger than God. As it turned out, though, God had news for him. And in Daniel chapter 4, unusual for the Bible, we get to hear straight from the pagan king himself. It's not a short chapter, but I'd like to read the chapter in its entirety and to read what Nebuchadnezzar had to say for the people of his day and also to us. So beginning in verse 1, chapter 4, this is what we read. King Nebuchadnezzar, to the nations and peoples of every language who live in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. And I had a dream that made me afraid. As I was lying in bed, the images and visions that passed through my mind terrified me. And so I commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be brought before me to interpret that dream for me. And when the magicians, enchanters, and astrologers and diviners came, I told them the dream, but they could not interpret it for me. Finally, Daniel came into my presence, and I told him the dream. And he is called Belteshazzar, after the name of my God, and the spirit of the holy gods is in him. And I said, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery is too difficult for you. Here is my dream. Interpret it for me. These are the visions I saw while lying in bed. I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land, and its height was enormous. And the tree grew large and strong, and its top touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Under it the wild animals found shelter, and the birds lived in its branches, and from it every creature was fed. But in the visions I saw, while lying in bed I looked, and there before me was a holy one, a messenger coming down from heaven. And he called in a loud voice, cut down the tree and trim off its branches, strip off its leaves, scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it and the birds from its branches. But let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground, in the grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by for him. The decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes and sets over them the lowliest of people. This is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now, Belteshazzar, tell me what it means, for none of the wise men in my kingdom can interpret it for me, but you can, because the spirit of the holy gods is in you. Then Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. So the king said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its meaning alarm you. And Belteshazzar answered, my lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies, or its meaning to your adversaries. Because the tree you saw, which grew large and strong, with its top touching the sky, visible to the whole earth, with beautiful leaves and abundant fruit, providing food for all, giving shelter to the wild animals, and having nesting places in its branches for the birds, your majesty, you are that tree. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to the distant parts of the earth. Your majesty saw a holy one, a messenger coming down from heaven and saying, cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump bound with iron and bronze in the grass of the field while its roots remain in the ground. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the wild animals until 7 times pass by for him. And this is the interpretation, your majesty, and this is the decree that the Most High has issued against my lord the king. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass with the ox and be drenched with the dew of heaven, and 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. And the command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. Therefore, your majesty, please be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be then that then your prosperity will continue. And all this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace, he said, "Is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" And even as the words were on his lips, a voice came from heaven, "This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox, and 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes." And immediately what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from the people and ate grass like the ox. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. And at the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. And then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" At the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. And my advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. And now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right and his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. This chapter concludes with those words of truth from the king's lips, but as we saw, he had to learn that the hard way. And it took him a while too. And we read that a whole year passed after he was warned in that dream of the tree before the events took place. He had quite a while to turn his life around, but he didn't. And the next thing he knew, Nebuchadnezzar was mooing like a cow. Now, that had to be something of a sight. I mean, to see the most powerful man in the world crawling on all fours and eating grass in the pasture. The years would pass, and he would look a lot less like a king and more like a wild animal. His hair grew out and was tangled. His nails grew like claws. Now let's just go ahead and assume that he probably didn't smell that great either. This once bright, handsome, royally dressed ruler was now ugly and repulsive. People would have seen him there, munching in the meadow, and they would say, is that King Nebuchadnezzar? Really? What happened to him? Well, what happened to him was the direct result of his pride. I mean, looking at his statement on his rooftop, it was all about him and his power, the glory of his majesty. And he failed to recognize and acknowledge that it was God who gave him the kingdom, allowed him to rule. I mean, this would have been the equivalent of a 16-year-old kid bragging about their brand new car, which of course they didn't pay for, but was given to them by their parents. I mean, those hanging gardens of Babylon sure are wonders, but who do you think made the plants? At this point, Nebuchadnezzar, he knew of God and God's power and what God was able to do. The fiery furnace from the last chapter was proof of that. He had already acknowledged God with his lips, but he was failing to do so with his actions. And this was one of his major problems. And in verse 27, Daniel told the king not only to choose to live righteously, but to show mercy to the oppressed, both of which the king was neglecting to do. And for God, the king above all kings, that is not okay. Throughout the Bible, we see that humility and justice go hand in hand. Micah 6:8 famously declares, "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." There is a connection with mercy and justice and humility. Because when we humble ourselves before God and when we submit to God's will, we abandon our pride and our self-centeredness, and we begin to see the world the way that God sees it. And God's eyes are consistently on the poor, the oppressed, the downtrodden, people that God intimately cares for. For God hears their cries for justice. He hears their prayers, whether it's in Egypt or in Babylon or in Israel. And God compels those in power, those who have the ability to do something about it, to make it right and not worse. In other words, if you are at the top, you better take care of those on the bottom, or you may not be on the top for long. If we have any power at all, it is because God has given it to us. But God expects us to use that power for good and for the good of those around us, and not just for ourselves and for our own glory. God called Nebuchadnezzar and several kings in the Bible out for neglecting the poor and oppressed, people that God cares about, and He expects the world's rulers to take care of. And I'll say it again, if you are at the top, you better pay attention to those who are at the bottom. If you are at the center, pay attention to those on the margins. For that is where God goes. God humbles the proud, and He favors the humble. Apart from this chapter in Daniel, we see that truth over and over again throughout the Scriptures. Proverbs 3:34 says it fairly straightforwardly. He mocks proud mockers, but shows favor to the humble and oppressed. The New Testament quotes that proverb twice, in James and in 1 Peter. But James also tells us, humble yourselves before the Lord, and He will lift you up. And this is something that all people on earth must understand, not just kings, that we all need humility. And the last word on the subject comes from Jesus, He who was the perfect paradigm of humility, who spent His life with those on the bottom, who emptied Himself from the highest of heaven and lowered Himself in humility. Jesus tells us, Matthew 23, verse 12, whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. We might never be kings and queens of vast empires, CEOs of large corporations, or be anyone considered powerful or influential in the eyes of the world. We may never be Howard Hughes. But all of us have been given power by God, whether it be at work or at home or even here at church. There is power in the interactions that we have with one another. And as such, we must never think too highly of ourselves and our own achievements and our own glory and majesty. We are all susceptible to pride in its many forms. which turns our focus inward at ourselves instead of on those around us. And sometimes, like Nebuchadnezzar, God needs to humble us too. Now, fortunately for most of us, that's not going to involve believing that we are, in fact, a cow. But God is able to use the trials and the challenging times that we all undergo, including pandemics, to help us realize that we are all equal to one another and that we all rely on God. And I pray that, like Nebuchadnezzar, we can see how in the end, being humbled can be a very good thing. For acknowledging that God is in control is the beginning of so many good things in our lives. Realize that apart from God, we are nothing. That God is everything, and that we need Him. Yield to God's kingship and power and to God's will. Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and He will lift you up far higher than you can ever lift yourself. For this is the gospel we are preaching, the good news that we are proclaiming, not just with our words, but with our lives. In the end, all good things, all blessings come from God. Everything God does is right and just. And so may God receive all glory and honor and praise.